I want to bring in New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, Chris Marr, a former Pentagon spokesperson in the Biden administration, and Jamil Jaffer, founder and executive director of the National Security Institute. He's also a former counsel to the House Intelligence and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Good to see all of you. Peter, these efforts to sidestep or minimize what happened is a familiar part of the Trump playbook. How is it working this time, and could this incident possibly be too big for it to work?
Well, that's a very good question. We'll see. This is a test of how far Trump can go in bullying his way past a controversy that normally would concern certainly Republicans quite a good deal. Remember, Republicans are the ones who, talked about the dangers of using a private email server when the then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton did that they said that those emails, most of which were not anywhere near classified, in fact, weren't even marked as classified at the time, nonetheless was an example of sloppiness and carelessness and recklessness on the part of a senior official. Well, Secretary Hegseth may be right that the certain information was not in these particular signal chat messages, but let's remember what was in there, the specific time of the attack in advance. If you knew that and you were the target of that attack, certainly that would be a useful thing to know. And certainly that has to be a sensitive thing that nobody would want out there. Certainly Republicans on the Hill very nervous about that. You're hearing talk of whether they should be investigating and whether or not Mike Waltz or Pete Hegseth should lose their jobs.
So, Jamil, Attorney General Pam Bondi was asked about all of this today. Here's what she had to say.
It was sensitive information, not classified, and inadvertently released. And what we should be talking about is it was a very successful mission. Our world is now safer because of that mission. We're not going to comment any further on that. If you want to talk about classified information, talk about what was at Hillary Clinton's home that she was trying to bleach bit. Talk about the classified documents in Joe Biden's garage that Hunter Biden had access to.
So, Jamil, you heard her quickly try to deflect Hunter Biden, Hillary Clinton. Are you hearing any concerns that this goes beyond, tightening communications, that this has already caused real damage and, trust from our allies, the national security community, the military? Is there a longer-term impact here?
Well, certainly we know that our allies are not thrilled with what they saw in the chat, but it wasn't that much different than what they probably heard in Munich from J.D. Vance directly, and what they've seen from President Trump a number of times. So I don't think they're that surprised. It's probably not great to see it in writing, but there it is, right? I guess the real question is what happens going forward? I think the strategy here has been a mistake, this idea of going after Jeffrey Goldberg because he's too liberal or hates Donald Trump or saying it's not classified. I mean, all they're doing is extending the story. I think the right players to say, look, we don't have a good communication system that works for TSSCI material. We can't do real-time chats. It's not working well, so we use Signal. That wasn't a great plan. We're going to do better next time. We're going to create a better system and move on. If that had been their position from the beginning, if they pivot to that now, they'd probably be in better shape. I'm not sure why they continue to go down this danceless line of classified, not classified, or, Goldberg's a person we don't like. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Is there a question in your mind about whether this was classified?
Look, I mean, there are arguments you could make. Oh, the Secretary of Defense declassified it. He's the owner of this information. Or once the operation was underway, of course, this was before the operation began. But once it began in process that you're declassifying the information. I mean, there's a lot of arguments they could make. And there's, you could dance on the head of a pin about. Well, look, it's not actually my decision or our decision. At the end of the day, the decision about whether something is properly classified ultimately rests with the president and those who are original classification authorities. They could make that call. It doesn't look like they did make that call here. So I think as a general matter, would I think these kind of things are classified? Sure. Can they argue it's not? Maybe so, and they're doing that, but why? It just doesn't make sense. They're just extending the story further, but getting themselves into more trouble. It doesn't make a lot of sense. If they're trying to move on from this, the right play is, you know what? It wasn't a smart move. We're going to do something different. We're going to get better communications services and move on with your life. I think actually that's where the public is probably at. I don't think everyone's really spun up over what happened here at the end of the day, but it's obviously the story continues.
Yeah, and Chris, Secretary Rubio said, and I'm quoting, I think there will be reforms and changes made. How does that happen if the people in charge don't admit it was a mistake in the first place?
That's exactly the challenge here, Chris. Really that's why I don't really get the logic. Oh, sorry.
That's okay, Chris.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, the fact that they can't even say that this stuff was classified, that because there were no locations and units mentioned, just shows how not fit for the job that somebody like Pete Hegseth is. Where does he think those Tomahawk missiles are coming from? Where does he think those F-18s are taking off from? We know, and our adversaries certainly know, that it's from an aircraft carrier strike group in the Mediterranean Sea. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the location if they have the general idea of the timing of the plans. And so what do we need to move forward? We need to put in place people who are going to be responsible with very sensitive, very classified information, and make sure that the troops below them can trust that our most senior government officials are making responsible decisions when they're putting their lives on the line.
So, Peter, the National Review, conservative National Review, which called for, I should say, Secretary Hegseth to step down, I think a couple of days ago, ran an editorial this morning, and I'm going to read part of it. Damage control is not supposed to cause more damage, but that is what President Trump's team has created with its reaction to the signal leak story. As a matter of crisis communications, it would have been better if Trump officials had simply admitted that they had made a grievous error and promised to tighten up their communications efforts. But look, you've written books on Donald Trump. Is that in their playbook?
Yeah, admitting error is not really on his call sheet. You know, that's just not something he tends to do. Now, this is the era of his aides. He is more willing to throw them under the bus if he has reason to be unhappy with them for other reasons. But he gets his, his backup when the political culture, the media in particular, are after somebody working for him. And that's when he tends to dig in and say, no, I'm not going to go along with that. I don't want to give in to the chattering class, if you will. But, look, there are questions about the president's support for Mike Waltz going into this, even aside from this signal chat. There's been questions about whether or not Waltz really is his preferred choice at this point for a national security advisor. Look what's happening with his friend Steve Witkoff, who's being used for all of these diplomatic ventures. So, if he has some other concerns about Waltz, it certainly doesn't help him. Hegseth probably a stronger position because he's a Senate-confirmed official. The president doesn't want to have to go through, getting somebody else through the Senate at this point and wouldn't want to back down or look like he made a mistake.
But, Chris, does this speak to concerns of some people that this administration, since the beginning, hasn't chosen people that have the kind of depth of experience that we've seen in other administrations, Democratic and Republican, that someone like Secretary Hegseth is not familiar enough with the processes, with the procedures, with the way things work in Washington, but particularly national security information, knowing what should and should not happen. In essence, experience matters.
Experience matters a great deal. And the thing is, there are plenty of people on that signal chain who could have done the right thing. I think there were 18 people on that chain. Not a single one of them took a step back and said, hey, guys, maybe we should think about where we're talking about this stuff. In my experience at the Pentagon, we did very similar operations over and over and over again against the Houthis and otherwise. All of those, there's no dispute that this was a successful operation. That's not in dispute. But we had plenty of successful operations during the Biden administration. The planning and discussion for those took place in secure facilities on secure devices. It's not rocket science. It's all laid out for you. And if you're not able to follow it, if Pete Hegseth is willing to just copy and paste specific times, specific details when the bombs are all going to start dropping, that's just plain irresponsible. It's shameless, and there needs to be accountability.
So, Jamil, as you suggested, as the National Review suggested, they did not take this on in a way that a lot of people have suggested that they should have. So now the two heads on both sides, the heads of the Armed Services Committee, Senators Wicker and Reed, say they're going to ask for an expedited investigation by the Defense Department's Office of Inspector General. But Trump fired the Inspector General at the Pentagon 2 weeks into his term. I mean, who would even investigate? Do you think that the next step is some sort of investigation? Where do you see this going, Jamil?
Well, look, it's interesting they called for an investigation by the Inspector General because, Congress could obviously do its own investigation if they chose to do so. And that's probably where this ends up. I think Peter's right to say that the president wouldn't be afraid to throw somebody under the bus if he saw it in his own political interests. Right now, it looks like, as Peter says, the president's sort of consolidating around his team, as you laid out in your opening, Chris. And I think at the end of the day, that's likely where it's going to end up. Now, there's a possibility if it really heats up on Capitol Hill and the president feels under pressure, he then will lash out and pick somebody. It's kind of like Hunger Games in the Trump administration. So we'll see what happens. But I think at the end of the day, I think if they were playing this right, I think what Peter and Chris both just laid out is at the end of the day, there's a way to solve for this. I doubt Pete Hegseth's going to get fired. I doubt Mike Waltz is going to get fired. I think the president's going to consolidate his team. They're going to make the case that they did what they had to do here. That was a successful operation, and they're going to move on and try to find a way to do this going forward. Unless Congress really comes down hard on them, I don't see this changing. To be honest with you, Chris.
Chris Marr, Jamil Jaffer, thank you.